I want to show you right quickly the right way to save images for the web through Photoshop. There is a couple different ways, and you just want to do it the right way. So I'm going to open up Photoshop here and then share my screen momentarily. And you should be able to see my DuckTales, Scrooge McDuck background here from Disney Channel in Photoshop. When you are saving imagery for your website, even though you can just drag any old image to your media library or whatever it's called inside of WordPress, even though you can just drag any old image there and it'll automatically kind of resize to different sizes for you and stuff, really best practice that you make sure and prepare your image for the web first. Now, one thing that we'll talk about in a later class is actually like running through some color tests as far as like trying to get your levels reasonable for someone that might have different color blindness and things like that. And certainly to make sure that your contrast with whatever you have, you know, on the image, that information you want to get across, there's kind of another level to it that we'll talk about later like that. But for right now, I just want to make sure that you're doing the basics in terms of saving something at a correct size, as well as compressed correctly, all right? So you should always, when saving image for the web, it should always be one of two different image formats. It should either be a PNG or a JPEG. Most of the time, it should be a JPEG. The only time that you should use a PNG is when you need a transparency channel, all right? That's really the biggest difference, is that when you need, I guess there sometimes maybe with like a logo or something that's pure vector that doesn't have a lot of color value to it, then maybe you'd want to use a PNG as well, but it's all about file size, all right? File size makes all the difference in the world on the web, because literally Google will rank your page like less than a competitor's page if your images are too big and if your file size and if it doesn't load as fast. And you just have to realize that more people than not now are checking out your website on their phone, and they might be, you know, in some crappy data area or something like that. And you really have to account for making sure that you're not making someone download like 5 megabytes for your header image, right? So what you want to do inside of Photoshop is the first thing is you want to make sure that your image size is within a reasonable range, all right? So I'm looking at this, and this is 1920 by 1080. This is the HD standard, which is about as big as you would want any image. Like, you should never have any image bigger than this size on the web. Most of the time, you shouldn't even have it this big. But if you've got like 4,000 pixels or 8,000 pixels, you never, ever want to upload that into WordPress and use that on the web without bringing it down some. So if you have like a giant background image or something like that, and I can show you guys, you know, little tricks to putting backgrounds in at some point. You know, if you have a giant background or a giant like slider header image, it's like a big call to your attention image, maybe you'll want it HD size so someone on a desktop could look at it at full screen. It'll be nice and crisp and clear. But even if you do that, it's likely you might even want to create smaller versions of them and load up a smaller version for the different sizes. You know, remember how I showed you can create different sections for mobile phone and tablet inside of Divi and just show certain ones in certain situations? Well, that's a good reason you might want to do that, is if you have some big hero images that maybe you want to show like different, you know, sizes and compressed versions at the different levels, so you're not asking someone on a phone to download something huge. So first consideration is the actual image size. So this one's 1920 by 1080, about as big as I would make it. I'm going to go ahead and make this 1200 across. So it makes it, maybe I'll go 1280. Is that, okay, yeah, 1280 by 720 is kind of another level down. This is really common. You know, I mean, this is actually 100% inside of Photoshop. This is really common as a size because it's, you know, not quite HD size, but if it gets blown up like a little bit, it's not going to look too bad on a screen. All right, so a lot of people will make their main sizes like 1280 basically. The height is always variable. It just goes to 720 if it's, you know, the HD video standard aspect ratio here, but usually it's just the width that we're talking about. So very Very seldom will you need a full 1920 width. I would use 1280 as kind of a benchmark that even your large images should be. But then images that are smaller on your screen that might only be like half of the column or something like that. Maybe you only want to make that 600 wide. So just be very aware of how you're using your imagery, how big it's going to be on screen, and you should size its pixel value down appropriately. Be really aware that first off, we want to make sure that it's the right pixel value. So this is going to be a huge image, so I'm going to leave it here, even though I scale it down from 1920 across to 1280 across. Now, the next part is how to actually compress it. All right, now I could just do file, save as right now, and it can give me all these options. I can save as a JPEG, I could save as a PNG. If I save as a JPEG, let's go to my desktop here, and sure, it can give me these options of like the quality I want. But this is like, there's many ways to do the same thing in Photoshop because Photoshop's been around so long, at least when it comes to this image compression. And there's a specific way that is newer and better than all the other ways. That's what I'm going to show you. So instead of just doing save as and choosing one of these, what you want to do is you always, when preparing for the web, you want to go to File, Export, and then Export As. If you just do one at a time, which really makes sense when you're working on a smaller project and you're just kind of building it as you go. I'm going to click Export As, and this opens this dialog box. Now, there is a file, let me cancel this for a second. There's a file save for web. Oh yeah, the save for web here under export, and it says legacy next to it. I used this for years and years. It's kind of the same thing where it opens up a little window for you to start playing with the settings. But since then, Photoshop has updated with a completely new system for doing this. And it just makes the images smaller, makes them look better, all of that. So always use Export As. When you use Export As, it's going to show you the image. You can get two up and see like the original versus the one you're currently compressing, but I usually just leave it on the regular preview. Maybe I'll zoom in to 100% so I can see, where there's some issues here, what the compression is going to do. But right now, this is set by default to be a PNG, and it's actually showing me it's 1.4 megabytes as a PNG. Now, again, the only reason we would ever want to use a PNG would be if it's something really small in vector, like a logo. A lot of times, like a company logo, it's common to use a PNG like that. And another reason is if you need transparency, like if you've got circular images or any kind of image that's like cut out and you want the background to bleed through below it. The JPEG will not have that transparent channel, and a PNG will, but a PNG, unless it's a tiny little vector, will almost always be a larger file size. So because of that, if it's not a little vector and it's not have any transparency, then we absolutely, instead of PNG and 1.4 megabytes, we want to change it to a JPEG. All right, now a GIF or a GIF, depending on which one you think it is, that's very seldom used unless it has a couple animated frames into it. And then SVG is the most modern format for vectors, but you'll probably won't be working with SVGs. If you are, we can talk about that individually. But for the most part, you'll just be dealing with images. So if I choose JPEG, right away, without even bringing the quality down from 100%, it basically cut it in half. So it goes to 737 kilobytes. That's really important. It went from 1.5 meg to basically less than half of that without doing anything. Now, as I start dialing this back, it's going to start compressing the image and it's going to bring the file size down. So I bring it down to 77. Now it's all the way down to under 350K. So that just cut it in half again. And I don't see any issues with the image. Now, I typically start with a quality of 50%. Because even though it seems like, oh, I want my image to be better than 50%, well, Photoshop does such a good job now of resampling everything that on most images, you don't really see any visual difference. And notice I've got this down now to 165K. This is more reasonable. You really shouldn't have many images that are larger than 200K, 300 at the absolute maximum if you have a full HD image. Now, depending on the colors and the action in the image and how much detail is there, you might have a little bit more or a little bit less compression. This one doesn't have a ton of detail because it's a lot of kind of flat art, there's enough in there. And then you can see that, you know, if you look really closely, it can even, well, it's really no reason to zoom in past 100% because that's how you're going to see it. But let's see if I go all the way down to 0, am I finally going to see some degradation on the image? Yeah, so 1%, I can see it gets a little blotchy in here in the colors. I mean, it's not terrible. It gets it all the way down to 42 kilobytes, which is unbelievable. And a lot of high-end, you know, like if you're working for a major brand, they most likely will have either completely different images for each resolution. So if you're looking at it on a phone, you'll get much more compressed things, so they come up right away. Or there's ways like using JavaScript to actually like have one image that will have different levels of compression that it might show based on the user's bandwidth. There's like super hardcore ways to do it, but you know, it's very common to have separate images for different layouts. In this class, it makes the most sense just to have something that kind of works for everything. So as long as your pixel value isn't too big and it just fits what it needs to be on the page, and then you don't really go much higher than 50% quality. I mean, you can see the difference. All that blotchiness goes away. And I mean, you might be able to, with a very discerning eye, pick out the differences between 150. But for the most part, if you're at 50% quality for your JPEG, and you can even go down from there, the game is to get it as small as possible in your file size, but not really lose any of the detail or make it look sloppy. All right, so then hit export, and poof, it'll prompt you to save something, and you save your file. So again, if we were to have a transparency in here, so maybe I double click my background and I choose to cut out Scrooge McDuck here. There we go, you get the idea. I can file, export, export as, and if I were to try and export it as a JPEG, then it's not gonna, it's just gonna fill that in with white, all right? But if I export that as a PNG, it'll give me kind of the checkers, which lets me know this is actually getting the transparency channel as long as I have transparency like this. And with a PNG, there's no like quality slider. It's just, okay, it's a PNG, and this is 1.5 megabytes. So you can just kind of see how much difference that file size makes a big difference. And all of a sudden, if you've got 10 or 20 images on your page, that goes a long ways as well in terms of having, you know, just too much to make the user download. And it's not even always the user, it's just the search engine and things that will just flag you and tag you and say this is a slow, crappy site, so let's put all these other sites above it. Just something you want to be aware of as you start putting in your actual imagery.